Hey man, don't be so hard on yourself. Think about it. If this thing can live forever with its dumbass jelly bean ass buttons, anything is possible. With every new generation and game console release, surely we get new controllers right alongside them. Or so we thought. Alright, now obviously the GameCube controller living well beyond its initial generational lifespan is definitely more of a special little thing. It's not like Nintendo is putting out a brand new console and going like, up, and here's the controller for it. This is a special case, right alongside a couple of other controllers that lived beyond the normal lifespan of a controller. And I just kind of want to talk about some controllers that, through thick and thin, they still kept getting utilized or re-released or what have you. But surely we should just start off with the GameCube controller, because this is kind of the most notorious example. Obviously released around 2001. They also had the Wavebird. Which, as a kid, I didn't even think about this being like an official Nintendo product. I think the name Wavebird just kind of sounded like a Mad Catz ass kind of thing. But now I'd say this was the very first truly great wireless controller. Wireless controllers have been a thing before the Wavebird, but those all required you to point the controller directly at the receiver, almost like it was a TV remote or something. The Wavebird, I mean, hell, you could point it like that. I could point it directly at me, it's still gonna work. So the GameCube controller, in the sense of the Wavebird, was very revolutionary, a very innovative controller. But that's not the only reason why people loved this controller. This is often cited as many people's favorite controller of all time. And I'm one of those cretins that thinks that too. But here's the thing. I'd say the GameCube controller is one of my favorite controllers of all time. I wouldn't necessarily call it one of the best controllers of all time. I think it's definitely up there, but the GameCube controller is just a little too funky. For the games it works well with, it works incredibly with. I mean, it's to the point where some people will only play certain types of games with the GameCube controller. We'll get into that later. And the way it's designed, you can tell Nintendo was trying to do something a bit different. They were trying to go a little outside the box. The fact that you have two analog sticks, but one is the tiny nub-ass C stick. The button layout, you have these same buttons as a Super Nintendo controller, but they're laid out quite a bit differently now, and they all have incredibly different shapes. The D-pad is really small. There's only one start button, no select button. Even on the top, you have L, R, a Z button, and then just jack shit right over here. Comparing it to the competition at the time, the PS2 controller, I mean, like, come on. This controller obviously goes to bed early, goes to church on Sundays. This one is a fucking animal. You can look at the way they designed this, and it feels like it's an evolution from the N64 controller and trying to take a lot of elements from that controller and turn it into a more modern controller at the time, like the PS2 controller, but they still maintained a couple funny little things. Like the C stick is an evolution of the C buttons, and, you know, it's still kind of smaller and yellow to designate that, like, hey, yeah, this is kind of an alternate thing. Like, it's mostly meant for camera control. That's why it's called, you know, C. The fact that we have a Z button up here, well, there's a Z button down here. There's nothing else there. So yeah, just put a Z button up here. Nothing else over here. There's just a start button, no select button. You see? I respect what they were doing with the button layout here. You know, hey, like, this is your main button. Then in everything else around it, I really like how the buttons on the GameCube controller all have completely distinct shapes and placements. So then, like, you have one singular button that you're mainly focusing on, and then everything else around it you can instantly go to. When you see it in the game, you know, like, oh, the B button, I don't have to look down at the controller. I know that's that fucking pimple looking thing on my controller. Boom. However, while this setup worked for a lot of games, it wasn't the greatest for every game. And I think something like a much more traditional controller layout like this works way better just across the board for pretty much most standard video games. The GameCube controller was not ideal for first-person shooters. It worked, but just having one stick so much tinier is just kind of like, it just doesn't feel the greatest. I don't think it's the greatest for 2D platformers. The D-pad is way too small, and the button layout, a lot of 2D platformers are kind of designed around the traditional diamond button configuration. You know, the thing Nintendo invented. Kind of goes against that. So in a game like Mario, if you want to run and jump, normally that was mapped to Y and B. Well, that doesn't work very well now. However, for most of the games Nintendo themselves put out on the GameCube, the GameCube controller felt wonderful for them. Most notably, Super Smash Bros. Melee. I think it's fair to say Smash Bros. Alone kept the GameCube controller alive for decades to come. Outside of this controller just being damn comfortable, just the way everything is molded fits into your hands just so comfortably. But outside of that, the button layout just worked really well for what Smash Bros. Asked of you. A for normal attacks, B for special attacks, the C stick if you wanted to do quick smash attacks. The way the stick feels, it's just so quick to do very quick movements. On top of the fact that you have this octagonal layout, which makes it very easy to immediately do diagonals. So while I don't think this controller works for every game, the games that it does work well with, it just is a very solid controller. It feels great, even if the button layout is a bit more unconventional. For the games it works in, it works damn well in. But of course, the GameCube wasn't the greatest success for Nintendo, so they needed to kind of move on by the time 2006 hit the fan. So we got the Wii console, which was this brand new step for Nintendo. All the games look just like GameCube games. Yeah, the Wii wasn't this giant technical leap above the GameCube. It was kind of like a GameCube on a bit of the juice with a fancy new controller. It was definitely more powerful, but it was pretty obvious Nintendo was just kind of building off of what already existed with the GameCube instead of doing a massive generational leap. The GameCube did not sell very well, so let's do this crazy new idea while utilizing technical specs that are more in line with the GameCube to keep costs down. Well, at that point, you might as well just be like, it, include GameCube backwards compatibility, which is what they did. You know, always for a while there, you flip up the top, you have 4 GameCube ports and GameCube memory card ports. Definitely a little funny looking back at this era of Nintendo because, you know, going from the Game Boy Advance to the DS and going from the GameCube to the Wii, Nintendo ensured that both of these systems had backwards compatibility with the previous generation, even though they were like a complete departure from that previous system's whole branding and identity. You know, the Wii wasn't called GameCube 2, the DS wasn't called the Game Boy Advance 2, yet you could play those games on these new systems. Hell, it's pretty wild when you look back to when the Wii was originally announced as the Nintendo Revolution. Like, the original Revolution's logo featured a big Wii disc and a small GameCube disc as 2 of the O's in the name Revolution. And I just thought that was funny. Like, the fact that it can play new games on a DVD-sized disc and GameCube games, like, because the GameCube has those tiny DVDs, like, that's a big enough deal to put that in the fucking logo. But hey, I ain't complaining. GameCube backwards compatibility. The GameCube has a stellar lineup. So to be able to just play those old GameCube games on your Wii with original GameCube controllers is a big deal. But because the Wii had such a funky brand new controller, I think Nintendo wanted to make sure that, hey, if you don't vibe with these brand new fangled motion control devices, some games can still offer more traditional control schemes. Of course, Nintendo offered the Classic Controller and Classic Controller Pro, which you would just plug into the Wii remote, but some games allowed you to plug the GameCube controller into the GameCube controller slot, and boom, you can play a lot of brand new Wii games with this controller. Now, something that I always found to be very annoying about GameCube controller compatibility with the Wii is the fact that you have to use the Wii remote first and foremost to boot up a game. You have to use that on the Wii menu. You can use the Wii Classic controller's analog sticks to select the menu if you're using the Wii Classic controller, but the GameCube controller doesn't function pretty much anywhere on the Wii console outside of when you boot up software that's compatible with it, whether it be old GameCube games or Wii games that have GameCube controller functionality in them, which may be damn annoying, but I will definitely say some games, it was definitely worth going through kind of that small annoyance to be able to play them with a GameCube controller. On the Nintendo side of things, of course, these are the 2 big ones. With how big Smash Bros. Melee was, a lot of people got so damn accustomed to the GameCube controller that, of course, Smash Bros. Brawl allowed you to use that original controller. Now, that doesn't mean the Classic controller didn't work for Smash Bros. Okay, maybe I'll say that. This thing was definitely more so made for playing old school retro games on the Wii Virtual Console, specifically Super Nintendo games, and was kind of meant to be like a modern basic controller second. I mean, these damn sticks are way too close. What the hell are these triggers? Yeah, these are technically the triggers. It's ZL, ZR. Now, of course, a couple of years later, Nintendo revised the original Classic Controller with the Classic Controller Pro, which I find to be a much more suitable controller for a game like Smash Brothers or Mario Kart Wii, but it still didn't really have that same comfortable, substantial feeling the original GameCube controller had. Yes, this button layout is far more, responsible, but this is more so a controller that'll get the job done compared to a controller that I just flat out like to use. And Nintendo knew people liked using the GameCube controller specifically for Smash Brothers, because in 2008, only in Japan, they released a brand new white GameCube controller with an incredibly long cord, well after the GameCube was just all said and done. Like, the GameCube console was just not being talked about really at all at this point. But they brought out a brand new controller in white to kind of go alongside the Wii's branding, all because they knew this was an incredibly beloved controller. But unfortunately, Nintendo eventually started to phase this controller out. In later Wii models, specifically the Wii Family Edition, GameCube controller functionality and backwards compatibility was stripped out of that. Hell, it got to the point where games that were compatible with the GameCube controller, like Smash Brothers, this is a later print here, but as you can see, they took out the GameCube controller logo for its functionality here, pretty much just saying this can only use the Classic controller or the standard Wii Remote and Nunchuck. And then with the Wii successor, the Wii U, Nintendo also confirmed that doesn't support GameCube games or GameCube controllers or what have you. And hell, I mean, around the time Nintendo was putting out the Nintendo DSi, which wasn't supporting Game Boy Advance games either. It was pretty obvious Nintendo was kind of moving on from this generation, which makes sense. I mean, eventually, you just kind of have to do that. Yeah, as much as I would have loved for the 3DS to have a Game Boy Advance slot on it, it's also kind of like, well, this doesn't make a ton of sense. Like, it's cool, it's nice, thank you, but it's also like, eventually you kind of have to move on, especially if these things are using these old-ass media formats. Like, why the hell would we still be using GameCube discs in 2013? But with the announcement of a new Smash Brothers game for the Wii U, I think a lot of people were very concerned about the idea of playing a Smash Brothers game without the GameCube controller. Especially in 2011 at E3 when they announced the Wii U, pretty much the only controllers they announced for the thing were this chubby bastard and like Wii remotes and nunchucks, and like I think they announced like, oh, you can use the Classic Controller Pro on the Wii U. Thank you, but like, do I really want to play the new Smash Brothers game with this controller exclusively? Thankfully at E3 2012 they announced the Wii U Pro controller, which still, you know, like, it wasn't the GameCube controller. This is actually pretty far away from the GameCube controller design, but it's at least a very solid actual controller that you could imagine playing Smash Brothers with. So I feel like that's just what we had to accept. Like, all right, Smash Brothers is coming out for it. The GameCube controller is dead. Whatever. Life fucking sucks. It is what it is. Smash Brothers is releasing. However, I remember a news article coming out around the springtime of 2014 that said a controller manufacturer, I think it was specifically PDP, announced they were creating GameCube-like controllers for the Wii U for use with Smash Brothers, which was definitely a cool thing to see, even if it wasn't going to be the exact same GameCube controllers from back in the day. But then Nintendo decided to stomp all over PDP's potential sales with this device because, hooray! PDP. Yeah, this was a big moment where it felt like Nintendo truly read the room with what a lot of people wanted out of the next Smash Brothers, releasing an official GameCube controller adapter and also re-releasing GameCube controllers into stores. Yeah, this was a big deal. So damn big, in fact, this controller adapter was like impossible to find for a while there. And it's really nothing that special. It has two USB cords, one that helps to read the GameCube controller, and one that kind of enables power to the controller so then it can like do rumble. And you can use two of these adapters on a Wii U at once for 8-player Smash, but other than that, this is literally just a device to use the GameCube controller in Smash Brothers for Wii U and nothing else. It's really unfortunate because there was a lot of misinformation going around at the time, whether this controller adapter could be used in other Wii U games or anything really. Like, could you use it in Wii games you're playing through backwards compatibility that support the GameCube controller? In fact, the back of the box says, use only with the Wii U system. Look on the back of Wii U game packaging to see which games use the GameCube controller adapter. And it's literally just Smash Brothers, which really sucked. We had another Wii situation where every time I wanted to play Smash Brothers, I still had to select the game and boot into it with the Wii U gamepad. I couldn't do that with my GameCube controller. But it was what it was. You know, Smash Brothers was the only major game that kind of needed the GameCube controller. I think the Wii U Pro controller was a completely fine option to play the game with. And even if you couldn't find the GameCube controller adapter and you didn't want to use these old-ass controllers, you still had the other releases that were still happening. These were released by PDP. You plug them into the Wii Remote. This one released by Hori, you plug this into the Wii Remote. Wow! These aren't the greatest! Yeah, if you had the regular GameCube controller adapter, there wasn't really as much of a point to these, outside of the fact that these would plug into the Wii Remote and act as Wii Classic controllers. So, in Wii U games or Wii games that only use the Classic controller and you want that GameCube-like feel, these kind of gave you that. But obviously, the Nintendo-made ones were the way to go. Oh, in Japan, they also released this white variant of the new GameCube controller that they released to coincide with Smash Wii U. I don't know why they've kept these white GameCube controllers only in Japan, but I don't know. There's something I'm missing there. But even though the GameCube controller adapter for Wii U would accept any GameCube controller you threw at it, Nintendo still released these GameCube controllers with the Smash Brothers branding on them. And these still work as traditional GameCube controllers. I oftentimes use these guys on GameCube consoles. Now, to me, I've never noticed really any major difference with how these feel compared to how a traditional GameCube controller feels. I remember during preview events for Smash Wii U when some influencers got their hands on these controllers. Some said like, oh, it feels a little different. It feels a little cheaper. I don't really feel any difference, to be honest. The main difference is the fact that these are far newer. So yeah, they do feel different from the original GameCube controllers because those were like 15 years old at the time these released. So yeah, they were definitely a little worn down. But hey, this was a nice little gesture by Nintendo. They mass-produced GameCube controllers again, made them compatible with Smash for Wii U, and that was the end of that. Until they said, F it, let's do it again! Yeah, it was the same exact song and dance with Smash Bros. Ultimate 4 years later in 2018. They re-released the Wii U GameCube controller adapter, now without Wii U on the front, instead it just says Nintendo. And we got another GameCube controller re-release, now with a very bland Smash Ball instead of the flaming one from the Smash 4 version. The official box for this is funny to me because you go on the back and it says how it's compatible with literally like the past 4 generations of Nintendo consoles. But you know what's wild? The Nintendo Switch doesn't have the same limitation as the Wii U. If you plug this into a Nintendo Switch, this just acts as a normal like USB controller, meaning that if a game you want to play has all the same buttons that are on the GameCube controller, you can play any game on the Switch with the GameCube controller, which is fantastic. At the very least, you can select the menu icon with the GameCube controller now. But on top of that, basically every game you can play with a traditional GameCube controller. Hell, even some games officially support the GameCube controller, like Super Mario 3D All-Stars. Kind of a weird quirk with that game is that it used the analog triggers on the GameCube controller, but since the Nintendo Switch controllers don't have that, they kind of had to alter how that game controlled a bit. So it still works with regular Switch controllers, but you don't get the fine movement that you do with the GameCube's analog triggers. However, they released an update for that game where it officially supports the GameCube controller adapter, and that way you can get full analog control when you're using FLUDD in that game. Hell, you even have a game, Grid Autosport, that uses the GameCube controller. That's how you can get actual analog triggers in that game. When you use a GameCube controller, it fully recognizes it. However, if you don't want to deal with that damn USB adapter, you can deal with a drop in quality. This was also released alongside Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. This is one of those third-party licensed controllers. This one by PowerA, but of course it has Nintendo's license here. And yeah, it is a wireless controller, obviously themed after the original GameCube controller. Of course, it is themed after it, and it doesn't get it 100% right. The triggers have a different feel to them, and not necessarily like when you're using them, but just the shape of them is off. The D-pad feels quite a bit different. The sticks don't have the same kind of grippy material. It's honestly not bad, but it is definitely quite a bit cheaper than the official Nintendo-made one. And this isn't recognized as a GameCube controller when you use it on Switch. It's just kind of recognized as a generic wireless controller. But that brings us to the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2, where Nintendo actually released their very own wireless GameCube controller to coincide with GameCube Nintendo Classics getting added to Nintendo Switch Online. And yeah, this is pretty damn spot on. I do think the D-pad feels a little bit different, but overall, I mean, these Nintendo Switch Online controllers Nintendo's produced are always a treat. Yeah, they're really damn expensive, but I think it's so damn cool to have official brand new versions of these classic controllers that are completely wireless, and they work not only within the Nintendo Classics apps they're designed to work with, but also, I mean, like, they just work across the entire Switch. To ensure that this one does, Nintendo put a lot of the extra little buttons on the top here, including the smallest damn ZL button I've ever fucking seen. Obviously, they want to do this so then it masks the extra buttons as much as possible. So then when you're actually just playing this, you don't notice. It just feels like you're using a regular-ass GameCube controller. But out of all the buttons that they actually added to this controller, I find it baffling they didn't add a minus button. Like, they have a capture button, a fucking C button. Who the hell uses the C button? But there's no minus button. They put in a ZL button, and the start button on the front pretty much acts as a plus button. But yeah, that's a little strange. But yeah, throughout it all, hopefully you can see the GameCube controller has lived on for nearly the entire time it's been in existence. There's been a couple of years there where it kind of went extinct for a bit, probably from like 2011 to like 2014. Like, yeah, Nintendo wasn't really doing anything with the GameCube or putting out consoles that had GameCube controller support. But it's just pretty damn wild how this controller always finds a way to come on back. And we're at the point where you can use the old ass official controllers on your console. You can use these fucking things on your console. You can use newly produced wired versions on your modern consoles, and you can use newly produced wireless versions on your modern consoles. It's really funny to see like an officially released modern GameCube controller that is wireless without you know, the stomach of the Wavebird. But while Nintendo kept bringing the GameCube controller back due to demand, Sony kept on using the DualShock design just because I don't know, they were just lazy. Probably not that. I think Sony very much had a, if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality with their controllers. This is the DualShock 1, and this actually wasn't the first controller released for the original PS1. Here it is! Oh god, it looks naked. It's with this controller you can really see the origins of the PS1 kind of coming from a bit of a partnership Sony had with Nintendo, developing a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo. But of course, with more 3D games coming out, Sony obviously had to create a revised version of this controller. So, behold! The PlayStation's dual analog controller. Yeah, a lot of people don't know this, but Sony actually released a controller very shortly before the DualShock actually entered the scene. Here we just have like a pretty basic revision of the original PS1 controller, just with dual analog control now. Of course, what makes the DualShock the DualShock is the fact that it had rumble support. So this controller doesn't have that, and the only other major difference is the fact that it has concave thumbsticks, not convex. Which convex thumbsticks do make sense, you know, there's nothing wrong with them, but concave thumbsticks are what PlayStation is all about. I know that because they stuck with these designs for like 20 years. The PlayStation controller design was not bad by any means, but when you saw Microsoft and Nintendo consistently revising their controllers over the years, and then you just look over at the PS3 and it looks pretty much the goddamn same to the PS1, that's when it goes like, all right, man, I don't know about this. Especially when they would add things, but they wouldn't change anything else about these controllers. So the PS2 had analog face buttons, which is a stupid fucking idea. With something like analog triggers, it's almost like you're putting your foot on the gas. So, you know, there's a much greater degree of figuring out like, all right, so I'm starting here and I go down here, and there's a degree of movement between that. face buttons, there's no way I can tell that. How do I know when I'm at the limit of how hard I can press this down? The PS3 controller easily added the most out of all of these revisions. The fact that it's wireless now, it has motion controls, and it has analog triggers. But, you know, these analog triggers also kind of highlight, you know, the problem with sticking with like a 10-plus-year-old controller design. Because you compare this to the competition with the Xbox 360 controller, this trigger ends with this molded plastic right here. The PS3 controller, it's so much easier to just slip off of these. Oftentimes when I'm playing PS3, I find that it's really hard to keep my finger on the trigger. It always finds a way to slip off. Now, I've heard many people criticize something like the PS3 controller, saying like, oh, since it's pretty much based off of the PS1 controller, and the PS1 controller was fundamentally based on the Super Nintendo controller, this is like an ass-old controller. It needs revised. And to that I say, well, yeah. But also saying that the PS3 controller is just a Super Nintendo controller. I mean, like, what? You can say the same about any other controller. They've all taken notes from the Super Nintendo controller. They all have the diamond configuration of the face buttons. They all have either the D-pad or analog stick right here. They all have the start and select right here. They have the shoulder buttons. Like, I'm like, hey, Sony does have a point. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. This controller did the job, but it's incredibly obvious why Sony moved on from this controller. The DualShock 4 went for a much more curvy, ergonomic feel, and you also have concave analog sticks. What a world we live in. You can even see with how Sony designed the analog triggers now, these kind of curve upwards, which makes it far harder to slip off of these compared to these ones. The original PlayStation controller design refused to die, but I think it refused to die for some decent reasons. I feel like Sony really did look at this controller design as a part of their heritage. You know, it's kind of like, hey, this controller design still works, and it's what makes PlayStation PlayStation. And I do kind of agree to an extent. Even though the DualShock 4 and DualSense for the PS5 are in fact much better, this original design feels much more like PlayStation, even though that's probably entirely just because it was the design for the first 3 controllers, so obviously, like, it's one of the first things I think of. But still, I don't think anybody was begging for this controller design to stay. I think everybody was kind of hoping for something like what we got with the PS4 and onwards. So, as much as this controller is iconic, yeah, it was definitely showing its age by this point. Much like this stupid bastard. I am shocked, nay, appalled, nay, disgusted, nay, just shocked at how long the PlayStation Move controllers lived on. These released in 2010 just for the PS3, pretty much as just a way to combat the Wii and also the Xbox 360 Kinect. And you know, the PlayStation Move worked for what it was. The word I'd use to describe the PS Move is smooth. Whether it's tracking your movement with a cursor or just holding it, it's a very smooth feeling experience. The fact that it used the PlayStation Eye to detect the glowing orb made it pretty foolproof. Or at least it felt like it made it pretty foolproof. Because from my perspective, using this thing, like, it's just like, okay, there's a camera and it's detecting a very specific glowing orb. There's no way it can f this up. So that just made when it got f***ed up even more pathetic. I'm just like, how is it f***ing this up? This is so simple. It's a giant glowing orb. But the PlayStation Move worked. The games available for it were fine, but it just didn't really reach the same amount of notoriety that the Kinect did. I mean, when the Kinect launched, it was a huge deal. Everybody wanted one. It seemed like it was gonna be the next big thing until people tried it out. They played it for like 30 minutes. They were like, all right, well, that's kind of fun. And then they just kind of stopped giving a shit. So I'd say the Kinect was more of a short-term success, but it kind of fizzled out very quickly. The PlayStation Move was never a failure, but it just wasn't really talked about in the same way as Kinect. Nobody was really talking about the PlayStation Move in casual circles. But the longevity of this controller is genuinely quite impressive. It's kind of similar to the PlayStation 3 itself. I mean, all throughout the PS3's life, the Xbox 360 was dominating it. But then in those last couple of years, you look at how many units both of the consoles sold, and the PlayStation 3 actually ended up selling a little bit more than the 360. Like, it won in the end. And the PlayStation Move is kind of similar. Like, you don't really look at this like it was the winner of the motion control war of 2010, but I mean, it had a pretty damn long life. During the PS4 reveal in 2013, they also revealed the game Dreams, being developed by the Little Big Planet developers. And the whole thing they were showing there was utilizing the PlayStation Move controllers to do like a little dance sequence. They made it a point to pretty much show that the PS Move would be compatible with the PS4. And strangely enough, I didn't really realize how many games are actually compatible with this controller. Picking up a game like Little Big Planet 3, going on the back, yep, it's not only compatible with the PS Move, but also the PlayStation Move navigation controller. I think that's pretty nuts. I mean, already, I don't think a lot of people know the PS Move is compatible with a handful of traditional PS4 games. But I think even less people know the fucking navigation controller is. This is some disgusting artifact from a forgotten age. Pretty wild that even though Dreams finally came out in 2020 after it got announced in 2013, like this thing refused to come out for years. And when it finally did, they made true on that initial reveal, PlayStation Move motion controller compatible. However, the primary use for this on PS4 was with PlayStation VR. For any game that was a motion control heavy game, they were oftentimes compatible or downright required a PlayStation Move controller. Hell, sometimes it required 2 PlayStation Move controllers. Now, they did release PlayStation Move controllers for the PS4, but I believe the only major thing they changed was the charging port. Like, these PS3 ones use mini USB and the PS4 ones use micro USB. But since the PS5 is backwards compatible with the PS4 and they made sure PSVR works, yeah, these dirty ass PS3 PlayStation Move controllers still work on the PS5. Now, no new games use them, and I think after a while, you know, the PlayStation VR requiring PlayStation Move controllers, it just kind of felt like, all right, come on. You know, like, yeah, these do the job, but when you look at all these other VR headsets that have finger detections and just far more impressive and ergonomic motion controllers, for PlayStation VR to be using a PlayStation Move controller from 2010, yeah, it kind of felt like, all right, it's impressive this thing lasted this long, but let's move the hell on. And that's what they did with PlayStation VR 2. That headset has its very own unique motion controllers. It's just a damn shame nobody gives a fuck about PlayStation VR 2. Here's another one, the Xbox One controller. Released in 2013, and this already is pretty damn similar to the Xbox 360 controller it replaced. However, I do think I still prefer the Xbox 360 controller. In many ways, the Xbox One controller and onwards feels a bit more premium, but I just feel like ergonomically, the Xbox 360 controller being much more rounded just feels much better in my hands. I also think the Xbox One controller is very loud. Like, come on, everything just clacks a lot more on this thing, but it's still a fine controller. Fine enough to not change a goddamn thing. You have some design differences. The more modern Xbox wireless controller has a bit of a, like, texture on it. Kind of makes it a little easier to grip onto, and that same texture is on the triggers, which kind of makes for an overall, I guess, grippier experience. They adjusted the D-pad yet again. These Xbox controllers do nothing but constantly adjust their D-pads. Like, the Xbox 360 D-pad was notoriously not well liked, and then they did this revised Xbox 360 controller with a transforming D-pad. Oh boy. Honestly, I got nothing out of this other than fidgeting with it every now and then. And then they go over to this D-pad, which is definitely a bit more of a traditional D-pad. It's fine. And then they go to like this rounded one with like a disc there. I mean, it also works, but like, god damn, they're changing this thing all the time. But even with a few changes, fundamentally, the Xbox controller has pretty much been the exact same thing for over a decade. And this is definitely kind of like how Sony was during the first 3 PlayStation consoles. Very much, it ain't broke, don't fix it. But you look at stuff like the DualSense and the Switch 2 Pro controller, and I feel like those are making strides in ways that I never really thought before. The thumbsticks on the Switch 2 controller, the overall feel of the DualSense, it all feels incredible. And the Xbox controller is just, it's just kind of fucking there. It's functional. It uses batteries. Oh, wow, that's so cool. But it just feels like a very basic-ass controller by comparison. It's whatever. I mean, I do kind of like how the Xbox controller is very much like, it is what it is. It knows what it's about, and it's not about giving you some fancy-ass little gimmicks, even though a lot of those gimmicks are very well appreciated. But I just think it's disappointing that this is a controller that just refuses to die or move on and just evolve to something a little more interesting. But folks, I saved the stupidest one for last. Yep, that's sure stupid, and it sure also is last. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about the Sega Genesis controller. This thing never dies, and in a weird way, mind you. This is a crappy little plug-and-play console released by Games. You know, they were kind of infamous for making these partnerships with a lot of these retro game companies like Atari, Namco, Sega. Basically, they just put out these cheap little things that are mostly meant to appeal to people walking through a Walgreens and going, oh wow, I remember Centipede. And then they pick it up and then they try it out for like 30 minutes and they go, yep, that sure is Centipede, and then they move on. But you know what's weird? Centipede is a game that uses a trackball. It also wasn't a game that I primarily associate with the Sega Genesis. But then you look at this other one. Oh, it's Pitfall. Pitfall was on the Atari 2600. Well, you'd primarily play Pitfall, which is an Atari 2600 joystick, but like not, here's another Sega Genesis controller. Then you have another one. Oh my god. Now that particular Games console seemed to be a hybrid between the mold of the first Sega Genesis controller with the button layout of the 6-button Sega Genesis controller that was later released in the console's lifespan. But that's besides the point. Pretty much with a lot of these clone consoles or whatever, a lot of the times you see basically a clone of the Sega Genesis controller as the main controller. When I first started collecting, I bought a Hyperkin Retron 3. It was a 3-in-1 clone console system. The crappy-ass wireless controllers that came with it, yeah, they were just a clone of this. The Retrobit Generations. This was some really NES Classic Edition competitor that released around the same time. Would you look at what kind of controllers came with it? Hell, Retrobit even worked with Sega a couple years later down the line, and they actually fully re-released these types of controllers, both with regular Sega Genesis plugs and USB plugs. Like, this controller, yeah, it's not dying. You can't forget the Switch Online version. Oh god, they're poisoning the bloodline! Alright, now obviously me saying, oh, these controllers just won't die. I'm not saying I want these controllers to die. It's just really interesting to see which controllers really do stand the test of time. Whether it's for completely justified reasons or just because for some reason they just don't stop using the same fucking controller design. I don't know. And who knows, maybe in 50 years, the shitty plug-and-play consoles of that era will have more interesting game controllers as their included options.